Okay, I'm calling the Conflict of Interest Board meeting to order on August 24th, 2023, and Catherine Miller is going to be our secretary.
Thanks, Milt. And Claire Wiseman is going to do a little introductory statement for us here to get us started, and then we'll open it up for a discussion.
Go right ahead.
Today, the board has before it consideration of proposed amendments to Board Rule Section 1-02 and the proposed repeal of Board Rule Section 4-03. Board Rule Section 1-02 defines which public servants are charged with substantial policy discretion, who are also known as policymakers. The board has amended this rule several times since it was promulgated in 1990 to refine the definition of who is a policymaker and to ensure that the rules, reporting, and notification requirements are not overly burdensome on city agencies. The current proposed amendments would do much of the same. Most significantly, they would codify and build upon practices the board has developed in implementing the rules, reporting, and notification requirements. They would change how often city agencies must report their policymakers to the board to twice a year instead of only once a year. And they would add a subsection to the definition of policymaker, which applies to very large city agencies. Finally, staff proposed repealing Board Rule Section 4-03 as it's redundant under the annual disclosure law, and the proposed amendments to Board Rule Section 1-02 make clear that its definition applies to the annual disclosure law. Are there any questions from the board about either of these?
How many agencies will be affected?
Right now, only 3, and most likely into the farthest future.
And do you have sufficient staff to accommodate the increased filings?
It probably won't, this addition by itself probably won't increase the number very much, though some of these agencies are a little opaque in exactly what their sort of management structure is. So it's a little, there's some speculation about that. But my guess is this addition won't by itself increase the number very much, but it will create a baseline where there's no need to sort of do an in-depth analysis beyond that, and then we can address individual public servants based on the already existing criteria in the rule.
Yeah, that was the question I first of all, I appreciate all the work you did. I think the concepts and the goals are excellent and right on point. I would like more information sort of on the background, because I don't know, why is it 25,000? Why is it 4 levels? You know, the current rules have like including agency heads, deputy agency heads, assistant agency heads. How come those don't already fall under this? So I just need a little bit more information.
Sure. So the existing rule, right, that sort of mechanism of having a list of different positions identified is a little bit of a challenge, because different agencies are organized in different ways and have different titles for their positions. So somebody who is a director at one agency is, performing the kinds of work you might describe as being policy-making work, whereas a director at another agency is not. The titles don't necessarily translate across agencies. So that mechanism is only useful, up to a point. And so and these 3 agencies in particular seem to have an issue of under-designating public servants, especially in comparison to sort of, let's say, medium-sized city agencies. So the police department is about 10 times the size of the Department of Transportation, but has about the same number of policymakers designated. The Department of Health and Hospitals is about, I think it's about 5 times the size of the Housing Authority, and actually has fewer people designated as policymakers. And that, so that sort of at the outset seemed to be an issue, and as we started trying to poke at that, it became clear that it seems like some part of that problem is just not recognizing large offices at city agencies, particularly these very large city agencies where they have borough offices or lots of sort of decentralized
Right.
locations are not correctly identifying people who are actually making independent decisions of the sort that the policymaker will
And you're
intended to
making,
capture.
and I think it's a reasonable assumption it's a quantitative, not a qualitative analysis, right? You're saying that because necessarily a larger agency, the head of a larger agency is always necessarily gonna have substantive policy decision-making authority.
Right, that's the idea. Now, the
Because
part
there
of,
could be, from a qualitative perspective, it might not pan out.
right, my bet is that we don't want to, like a fifth level is probably a fifth level
That was
going
gonna be my
to
next
capture
one, like
too
why
many,
four?
right,
Okay.
too many people that
Right.
are not actually doing this kind of work. Though there are probably a number of public servants at that level who are and would qualify under the other criteria and could be handled on a sort of case-by-case basis. But, so we don't want to have a rule that sort of blanketly causes over-designation. And so that's why we're suggesting the fourth level of management as being the sort of end of where this method of identifying people would come to a limit. One of the other features of the proposed amendments is that as part of the reporting to the board, that city agencies are going to have to provide an org chart, and that I think will, that may provide us with information that down the road we may need to tweak how we're doing this, but that information is information that's actually difficult to
We don't give us an org chart.
It's difficult. It's actually genuinely difficult to obtain.
Wouldn't we want to have that information before we come out with the rule?
Well, I think that that's why we're just doing. I mean, that's part of the thinking of like, let's just do it for these three super huge agencies where we feel like we're on very solid ground. We will have more information over the next, reporting periods that may make us want to revisit this as we sort of learn more about how the organizations are structured and so forth. But I think this is, we had contemplated sort of much more significant changes to the way we might define who a policymaker is, but thought this sort of, lighter, smaller change was a better sort of first step to identify, right, to try to capture the people who we feel very comfortable.
So the 25,000 is tied to these three specific agencies.
Right, the next largest
Nobody
agencies
else.
are significantly smaller.
Okay, so
So-
that answers my first question.
Right.
So the 25,000 is based on the three largest city agencies by far.
Right,
And the-
What about the Board of Ed?
That's one
that's one of
one of
them.
them.
So it's
Oh,
Board of
sorry.
Ed, Health and Hospitals, and NYPD.
Oh, I thought the fire was in there, but
Five's pretty small.
not reading carefully enough.
Fire is the next largest, but comparatively
Like this
much
big
smaller,
gap.
yeah.
And then the 4 levels is based on what?
Right.
I heard kind of like it feels right. But,
Right.
but-
No, I mean, no,
But seriously.
Yeah, certainly to some degree, it's a little bit of speculation on our part because it is, as I said, difficult to identify exactly. It's hard to obtain org charts that really sort of give us
Yeah.
the kind of information we need, or descriptions of all the job duties of all the people that might be appropriately charged with being policymakers. But that level of management is the level of management where we have been sort of going back and forth with these agencies about whether or not these people should be captured.
Okay.
For example, health and hospitals, which is in a significant way decentralized, right? It has all these very large hospital facilities around the city. Are essentially capturing only the heads of these hospitals, but these hospitals are huge facilities with tons of employees, and have large offices within them that probably that next level of management below the CEO of a city hospital would certainly be people who are running large offices and making certainly the kinds of decisions that this rule is intended to capture, and they're a level of management that is we believe the fourth level of management for health and hospitals, and they're not being captured right now at all. And that seems like those are an easy one.
Maybe.
No, maybe, okay.
Well, I'm just a little concerned, and to your point earlier, like are we gonna be the dog that caught the car kind of thing? Like, are we gonna have too many, might be capturing too many people, because 4 levels is a lot.
Right, I
I
don't,
mean, just
I mean-
a gut, again, just a gut reaction, 4 levels down, you're capturing potentially a lot of employees.
For example, do we happen to know whether it gets to principals? We got 1,500 of those, right?
Currently, it wouldn't get to principals. I think the superintendent is the 4th level down.
Fernando's concerns are practical and probably wiser than mine, but I don't think it logically follows that because the police department, for example, has disproportionately fewer filers than DOT, that it has too many, it has too few rather. I'd suggest that maybe DOT has too many. I've always been at the view that these lists, from particularly the medium-sized agencies, are too large. In the old days, people wanted to be on the list, and their feelings were hurt if they weren't called policymakers. That changed a little bit when it got linked with financial disclosure, so people then wanted to get off and say, oh no, I'm not a policymaker anymore. Surprisingly, they didn't care about whether they were restricted their First Amendment rights, but they were horrified that they had to fill out this silly little form, which is really not a bother. Nobody looks at it anyhow. For those people. Nobody does, right? Nobody requests those forms for those people, right? So that's what we're talking about right now. As a practical matter, we're asking more people to file forms that nobody's going to look at. Mostly. But I've always been of the view that restricting people's First Amendment rights is a problem. And a little bit of the charter revision history I've read on this is some quote, somebody, what's B12? You can't ask anybody for a contribution to anybody, right? Running for city office. Your next door neighbor doesn't know you work for government, right? The remark at the hearing was, we don't want deputy mayors out there buttonholing people, because people know who deputy mayors are, and there's weight there. We're already protected for, Carolyn putting the hit on the staff around this room, because there's another provision that says you can't ask your subordinates. There's probably something in the charter somewhere that says you can't ask the vendor's contract you oversee. So I think a lot of the evils are taken care of in the rule, and B12, for example, ought to be saved for the big guys, and B15, I mean, we want cops and firefighters to live in the city. Firefighters, forget that, but maybe principals too, who all live up in Rockland. But and to be participating in public affairs like they would if they didn't have a B15 restriction. So I just wonder globally whether this is a good idea. Fernando's got some, I think, valid practical concerns, but I guess I got a practical concern too. I mean, I filed this report for 15, 18 years on staff. I'm sure nobody ever looked at it. I forget whether I was on the policymaker list or not, but and this is another maybe in addition to all this, just reading, they've got this list of titles. I gotta admit, I don't pay too much attention to that list. I'm not sure what it means, and you talk about the inexact fit, but it's people who make policy. It's not managers. Managers don't make policy. Managers carry out policy. I mean, I've heard mayors or agency heads saying, mayors, there's one person in city government who makes policy, and that's me, the mayor, and the rest just carry it out. Now, maybe there are a few corporation councils and the like, important agents with a lot of power, who I'm not going to suggest that they don't, and maybe even the first assistant corporation counsel, and the law department kind of insists that the division heads have policy making. I'm not so sure about that, but that I think is too many. But boy, you're talking about, I don't know, some captain somewhere, and on the, I know this is a public meeting, but on the topic of who makes policy, I mean, you saw that there was some fairly high-ranking police, I don't know their titles, but who was thought to question the volume of car chases, and that person's now resigned. Why? Because somebody very high at the top, maybe not even at the department, probably the department, didn't like it. That's where the policy is set. And the rest are meant to carry the policy out. I mean, probably Carolyn's somebody who ought to be on a policymaker list, but I'm not sure you should be, or any of the other people on the level and staff. And that would hold it, DOT, maybe give them the deputy commissioners, but beyond that, at DOT, I think it's a mistake, and it, number one, it limits the First Amendment freedoms of those people, and number two, their reports aren't going to be looked at by the public, and I'm not sure that anything that would show in the report is going to capture corruption anyhow. That's not what these reports are about.
Well, the report, I mean, people pull reports for people when there's a problem, right? So I mean, it's people look at all kinds of reports, but essentially primarily when there's a problem. And if you haven't done the reports, then they're not there when that happens. And I think that the reporting, at least in theory, serves as a little bit of a reminder for people about, keeping an eye on what their own financial holdings are to make sure that they're paying attention to what their own actual private interests are. But all that aside, I mean,
that does prove too much, because that would require everybody to file.
Oh, right, yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, but the public interest in having there's a greater public interest in having the higher level people do it. So, but but what you're describing seems to suggest not merely a concern about our proposed addition to the definition, which was actually just intended to try to make sure that people who are really meeting the criteria as described in the current rule are genuinely being captured. But your concern seems to be more that you think the current rule is actually overbroad. Am I?
Well, I think probably the police department has it about right, although without having seen their list of filers at all. I would suggest probably theirs a little long, and the DOT, as you describe it, is way long. The rule's all right, I think, but I'm probably in the minority on that view.
Wayne, the DOT one is long because there's in the rule the phrase assistant agency head. And so there's at many agencies, there's a title, assistant commissioner and associate commissioner. All those people are designated for DOT and similar agencies. There's not a similar kind of title at NYPD, at the police department, health and hospitals, or DOE.
They use
just out of
different
Right, there
numbers.
just isn't that
It's
kind of
different-
title, so
it's
there's
numbers.
different structures, so like, at health and hospitals, they don't consider, and they're not, the CEOs of the facilities to be an assistant agency head, although that person has much more responsibilities, and I would argue is making decisions.
Heads
Right.
of hospitals, they got to file.
Right.
They gotta file.
Right, right. So that's the disconnect, where it's like DOT is following the rule. They're not like making some kind of independent judgment about like what this assistant or associate commissioner. The rule says assistant agency head.
These titles are kind of like bank vice presidents, always confuse me, but who's
Yes.
higher, associates?
Associate,
Associates.
And the rule says what?
assistant. It says agency head, deputy agency head, assistant agency head. Am I right? Am I making stuff up?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay,
if
thank you.
associates are higher than assistants, then associates are probably, it's agency heads, deputies, and assistants. Associates at DOT are assistants within the meaning of the rule, and assistants aren't, because you can call it whatever you want it, but if you're 4 down, it seems to me you're outside the rule. But we're nitpicking.
I think where Wayne and I's concerns kind of overlap, I guess where the Venn diagram kind of overlaps is, I think there's maybe some unintended consequences of not knowing the impacts of having a potentially overly inclusive rule that's based on quantitative as opposed to a qualitative analysis, right? Because I understand why you're doing it, it's rational, but I'm concerned from a practical perspective, you're capturing more people than necessary because you're basing on just numbers. And to Wayne's point, when you're capturing those other people, it's going to have impacts on their rights. And I just don't know if we have enough information to make an informed decision on whether this makes the most sense. I mean, I agree with the goal, I agree with the concept, but I think we may want to think through exactly what the impact is going to be.
Could we get the org chart first and then revisit for the,
Yeah.
at least to see what it is that they call the equivalent of a deputy commissioner at the PD or a associate commissioner or assistant commissioners. They're probably chief titles instead, or both. They always have a civilian in a uniform.
Yeah, we can do that, yeah.
How long do you think that'll take?
I'm guessing we can probably try to get it to you by the next board meeting. I can't promise that.
And there's not, changing the rule or modifying it today, does that impact your operations in any way significantly?
No, I mean, we've been, this rule has been operating in this sort of current format roughly since 1997. So if we're, if
Give it another month.
yeah, it's just the reporting cycle is in February. We want to make sure people have enough notice. But if we push this for the following year or something like that, I don't think that there's any tragedy there.
Okay.
So we're fine. It's more important to get the rule right. So we'll get the information and get back to you. If I could though, just let's just so that we sort of find out if there are other things we should be working on about the other parts of the proposed amendments.
I have a question, not no particular criticism, but there's something here that makes it easier for the agency to challenge, right?
An appeal process.
Yeah, right. And just remind me, what's the process for the designated employee to challenge? Is that in the rules, or is that just practice, or?
It's just, right, that has been just informal, essentially, right? That public servant will challenge whether or not they are a policymaker and, talk about it with board staff. And those have not come to the board because we've essentially been able to come to conclusions with city agencies about how to do that. That being said, right, I was thinking of this as a mechanism for city agencies to think about designation, not so much independent individual public servants. That could be.
But so the agencies mainly would be trying to add people, I'm guessing, right?
No, I think it's probably a mix.
Mix.
It's probably a mix.
I guess my concern is for the designated person who doesn't want to be designated. Now, a lot of them is because they don't want to file. But then they actually, and I think we've seen some in the past where people wanted to get off the list because they wanted to do something political. And it seems to me that ought to be, if possible. I don't want to make this any harder than it is, but think about it. Just if there's something that ought to be done there.
A lot of people file for other reasons that are captured in this category anyway, so that's not the motivating factor.
Yeah.
Because of their management level or other reasons. There's many more filers.
Yeah. Most challenges come from contract filers.
Yes. Yeah.
Any other concerns or questions about the other parts of the? Okay, great. So we'll gather that information as quickly as we can and bring this back.
Okay.
Okay. So.
Thank you.
Milt, could I get a motion to adjourn the meeting for until a future date to continue discussion?
Okay, adjourning the public hearing or meeting to a future date to be determined.
Can I get a second?
Second.
All right, so that passes and that'll close the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.